There is no clock inside the chamber, no windows, no way to tell if it is day or night, only breathing. The laboratory microphone crackles. It was installed to record voices, but what it captures now doesn't sound like speech anymore. It sounds damaged. A scientist leans toward the speaker. His voice is calm, trained, careful. "Confirm your identity," he says. There is a pause, then something whispers back. Not screaming, not begging, just a voice, dry and intimate. "We don't want to be freed anymore." Inside the chamber, the breathing changes. Too many lungs, not enough bodies. Someone orders the door opened. Gunshots explode through the concrete room. Metal echoes. Then, nothing. Years later, the report would say the experiment failed. But according to the surviving testimony, they never explained what walked out alive. Before we go any further, let the silence settle. If you're listening to this at night, don't adjust the volume. Don't reach for your phone. Just stay still. Let your breathing slow. This account was never meant to be dramatic. No music was written for it. No narrator was supposed to read it aloud. It exists the way memories do, uneven, fragmented, and heavier the longer you sit with them. What you're about to hear has circulated for years in pieces, scattered transcripts, recalled interviews. A story passed quietly between people who worked too close to it, not as fiction, as something they survived. There are no monsters in the usual sense, no curses, no ghosts waiting in dark corners. What happened in that sealed room didn't arrive from the outside. It came from the human body, when it was pushed past its final boundary. So understand this before we continue. This isn't a ghost story. It's about what happens when sleep is taken away. And once it's gone, something else takes its place. The world this began in was already exhausted. Post-war Soviet Union. Cities rebuilt with concrete and silence. Men who had survived one kind of horror, now designing another, quieter one behind locked doors. Winter pressed itself against every building. Cold, so constant, it stopped being noticed. The facility didn't have a name that appeared on maps. Just a block of reinforced concrete on the outskirts of a research district. No windows, at ground level. No signs. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and metal. Footsteps echoed longer than they should have. The prisoners arrived separately. 5 men. Political detainees, intellectuals, critics, people whose crimes were mostly words. They were thin, but not weak. Alert, used to watching what they said. They were told they had been selected for a study. 15 days, 1 room, full cooperation. At the end, freedom. No threats were made. No force was needed. After years of cells and interrogations, the idea of release was enough to quiet suspicion. They signed what they were told to sign. Most of the text was missing, redacted, or simply never written down. The researchers never raised their voices. They didn't wear expressions of cruelty or excitement. They spoke in schedules, measurements, dosages, men who had learned how to separate outcome from responsibility. The chamber was prepared before the prisoners entered. A single sealed room, concrete walls. No beds, no clocks, no mirrors. There was a small window of reinforced glass, thick enough to stop sound, thin enough to allow observation. Meals were slid through a narrow slot in the wall, identical portions, at identical times. Water came from a pipe with no visible source. The ventilation system never stopped humming. That sound became constant, a mechanical breath. There were no cameras inside the room, only microphones. Officially, this was to prevent damage to equipment. Unofficially, it meant no one had to watch what might happen. They would only have to listen. As for the gas introduced through the vents, it had no official name. In the paperwork, it was described only as a stimulant compound preventing sleep without immediate harm. No one involved ever wrote down what they thought it would really do. At the beginning, everything still felt controlled. The first 2 days passed without incident. Inside the chamber, the men talked. Not about politics, not about the future. They spoke the way people do when they're relieved to be heard again about food, old jobs, shared memories that didn't matter. Laughter drifted through the microphones, loose, unforced. To anyone listening, it sounded almost normal. The researchers logged vital signs at regular intervals: heart rate, respiration, tone of voice. Everything stayed within acceptable limits. If the logs ended there, this would have been remembered as a successful trial. By the third day, the rhythm changed. The conversations no longer waited their turn. Voices began cutting across one another. Sentences started before the last had finished. No anger, no panic, just speed. Speech accelerated the way a machine does when it's pushed too hard. Words stacked on top of words, thoughts breaking into fragments. Still, they laughed. It was written down as elevated stimulation. Sometime during the fourth day, one of the men stopped speaking. There was no announcement, no argument. His voice simply vanished. The others continued talking around him, as if silence had taken up a physical space. Hours later, coughing began. Dry at first, repetitive. It echoed against the concrete, growing sharper with every breath. The microphones caught it clearly. No one inside commented on it. Then, the coughing turned into screaming. Not a cry for help, not a shout. A single, continuous sound, raw, uninterrupted, pushing air past damaged vocal cords. The scream didn't rise or fall. It didn't break. It went on for hours. The researchers adjusted their headsets, checked the equipment, noted irritation in the throat. At some point, the screaming stopped. Not suddenly, just gone. The man who had been silent before never made another sound again. In the logbook, the entry was brief. Acute stress response observed. Subject remains alive. But among those listening, that was the moment they understood. The experiment was no longer about sleep. By the fifth day, the room had changed again. Not in any way the instruments could measure. The numbers stayed stable. The ventilation remained constant. But the men inside no longer spoke to one another. They spoke around each other. Questions were left hanging. Replies arrived late, or not at all. When someone laughed, no one joined in. It sounded wrong now, thin, forced, as if the body remembered how to do it but the reason was gone. Paranoia crept in quietly. Not shouting, not panic. Simple statements, said flatly. He's watching us. You moved when I wasn't looking. At first, the others ignored it. Then came the accusations. One man pointed across the room and said, "You're not real." No anger in his voice, just certainty. The one he accused didn't respond. He turned his face toward the wall and stayed there. Silence began to stretch, minutes at a time. The microphones no longer captured conversation, only what filled the gaps. Breathing, uneven and close. The wet sound of chewing as someone ate without acknowledging the others. Whispers appeared in the recordings, too quiet to identify as words. Sometimes only a single syllable. Sometimes nothing recognizable at all. The technicians replayed them repeatedly, trying to isolate meaning. There was none. By the sixth day, the men stopped asking questions. Not about the time, not about release, not even about food. Meals were accepted in silence, hands reaching out mechanically, as if the slot in the wall were the only thing that still existed. This absence was noted. People under stress usually beg, they bargain, they threaten. These men did none of it. They didn't ask to leave. The researchers reviewed the data again. The compound was doing what it was designed to do, preventing sleep. But something didn't align. Lack of rest brings collapse, confusion, desperation. What they were hearing sounded focused. The men weren't fighting exhaustion anymore. They were guarding something. When one of them slumped against the wall, another would jolt upright, watching, as if afraid of what might happen if eyes closed for even a moment. It became clear then. The gas wasn't keeping them awake. It no longer needed to. Whatever state they were in, they were choosing to remain there. In the observation room, no one said it out loud, but it was written later, in a margin, away from official language. Something had replaced exhaustion, and whatever it was, it didn't want to be interrupted. By the ninth day, The microphones captured nothing at all. No breathing, no movement, no whispers tucked into static. Just the steady hum of ventilation. For the first time since the chamber was sealed, the observation room grew uneasy. Silence didn't mean calm. It meant bodies failing. Vital signs had always been inferred through sound. Now there was nothing to infer. Someone checked the wiring. Another adjusted the gain. The room remained quiet. Too quiet for 5 living men. Protocol demanded confirmation. A researcher leaned toward the intercom, a feature meant to be used only in emergencies. His voice entered the chamber carefully, as if volume alone might provoke something. "State your condition," he said. "No threats, no promises, just procedure." The reply came immediately. Not overlapping, not rushed. A single voice answered, but it didn't sound like one person speaking. It sounded aligned, calm, even. "We no longer wish to be released." There was no tremor in it, no strain. It carried the certainty of a conclusion already reached. The men listening outside exchanged looks. That wasn't an answer to the question. The researcher pressed again. "You must confirm your identities." A pause followed, long enough to feel deliberate. Then the voice returned. "We are you, when you refuse to sleep." No one wrote that line down at first. It didn't fit anywhere. It wasn't agitation. It wasn't confusion. It was explanation offered without emotion, as if the answer should have been obvious all along. That was when the purpose of sleep was reconsidered. Not as rest, not as recovery, but as a boundary, a natural shutdown that kept something in check. They understood it too late. Sleep had never been the weakness. It was restraint. From the 10th day onward, the recordings changed character again. Not louder, not chaotic, sparse. Long intervals passed with nothing but ventilation and the faint scrape of movement across concrete, as if someone were dragging weight they no longer felt. When voices returned, they were brief. Statements without context. Observations without concern. "I don't need this anymore." That part is wrong. Then silence, followed by sounds the microphones were never designed to interpret. The men began to alter themselves. Not suddenly. Not together. One at a time. There were tearing noises, wet, careful movements, the dull impact of flesh meeting wall. No screaming followed. No spike in distress. Pain responses, when they appeared at all, were delayed, muted, almost curious. The researchers documented what they could. Pulse rates adjusted slowly. Blood loss, estimated by sound, alone. Still, no pleas came from inside. What should have incapacitated them didn't. Debate filled the observation room. Opening the chamber would end the trial. Leaving it sealed risked total loss of subjects. The original agreement, freedom after 15 days, no longer had meaning. Whatever was inside had already crossed past negotiation. Security was requested. Soldiers arrived without explanation, rifles held low, faces tight with uncertainty. They were told only this: the environment inside may be compromised. No one clarified what that meant. By the 13th day, movement inside the chamber slowed. Not because the men were weakening, but because there was less need to move. The sounds suggested repositioning, dragging, careful placement, as if the room itself were being reorganized. When the decision was made, it wasn't announced. The door seal was released quietly, with the same procedure used at the beginning. The first thing that escaped the chamber was not a body. It was the smell. It reached the hallway in layers. Copper, decay, something old and stagnant that shouldn't have been able to exist in a ventilated room. Several people stepped back instinctively. One soldier vomited without looking inside. The door opened fully. Inside, the room no longer resembled a place where people had lived. Bodies were arranged away from the walls, not collapsed, positioned. Limbs bent at angles that suggested intention. The concrete floor was no longer visible in places. One of the original 5 was missing. Not absent, unaccounted for. The remaining men watched the doorway closely, eyes clear, expressions alert. Too alert. When soldiers stepped forward, the survivors spoke at once. not shouting, pleading, "Don't put us back to sleep. We'll die if you make us rest." Hands reached out not for help, but to stop what they knew was coming. Medical intervention began immediately. Oxygen masks, sedatives. The moment the gas changed, panic erupted. Strength surged from bodies that should not have had any left. Bones fractured under restraint. Something inside them fought to stay awake. Time lost its order after that. Shifts blurred. Reports contradicted each other. The absence of night became noticeable not because lights stayed on, but because no one inside the chamber had needed darkness for days. As the surviving prisoners were removed, one truth became unavoidable. The room hadn't broken them. It had simply removed the last barrier between thought and action. And whatever remained was not finished yet. They were removed from the chamber one at a time, not carried, not gently guided. Each extraction required force not because the bodies resisted, but because they refused to stop moving. Limbs twitched even when restrained. Eyes stayed open through everything. Sleep had not returned with fresh air. The first subject didn't last long. The moment sedation deepened, his breathing stuttered, then collapsed entirely. No struggle, no last sound, just a sudden absence, as if something essential had been disconnected. Time of death was recorded without comment. The second survived longer. Medical staff attempted stabilization fluids, pressure, stimulation. When unconsciousness finally arrived, his heart reacted violently. Monitors spiked, then flatlined. The body remained still, but the face looked startled as though awareness had been torn away mid-thought. By the third removal, no one expected survival. Still, protocol continued. They tried to save him anyway. When sleep finally overtook the body, it was followed immediately by systemic failure. The pattern was undeniable now. Rest wasn't recovery. It was termination. Only one subject remained. He was transferred last, not because of compassion, but because no one wanted to be close to him. What lay on the gurney barely resembled the man who had entered 15 days earlier. Skin stretched thin, eyes fixed and unblinking. Every breath was deliberate, as if the body had to remember how. The doctor stood at his side longer than necessary. There were no instruments left to consult. Nothing new to record. Just one question still unanswered. He leaned close enough for the survivor to hear him clearly. "What are you?" he asked. The eyes shifted slowly. Focus returned sharp, aware, unmistakably present. When the answer came, it was quiet, not defiant, not afraid. "We are what remains," the voice said. "When you deny yourself the thing that keeps you human." The doctor waited. The survivor continued. "We are every thought you silence when you sleep, every impulse you bury, every part of you that wakes up when restraint is gone." His breathing slowed, not from exhaustion but from completion. The moment the words ended, the body relaxed. For the first time since the chamber sealed, his eyes closed, and immediately the heart stopped. No gradual decline, no struggle. Awareness ended, and life followed it. The lab fell silent again. No voices, no breathing. Just equipment humming in a room that suddenly felt too small to hold what had been uncovered. And no one there believed the experiment was truly over. Officially, the experiment never happened. The facility's designation was changed, the chamber dismantled, the ventilation system stripped down to bare concrete. On paper, it became a storage annex. Then nothing at all. The researchers were reassigned quietly. Different cities, different projects, new titles that had nothing to do with human endurance. No medals, no reprimands. Just silence, the kind used to bury inconvenient results. The files were sealed under multiple classifications. Sections removed. Audio logs labeled corrupted. Medical outcomes summarized in language so dry, it erased what had actually occurred. Failure. Inconclusive. No actionable data. That was the official ending. But stories like this don't survive on paper. They persist through fragments, a copied transcript, a reel that never made it to destruction, a technician who listened too long and never quite slept the same again. Someone kept the recordings. They always do. Years later, pieces surfaced in whispers. A line quoted out of context, a description that felt too specific to be invented. People dismissed it as fiction, an exaggeration. That made it easier to live with. Those who had heard the raw audio never argued. They knew better. They were the ones who reported insomnia that no medication touched, who stayed awake not from fear of nightmares but from the sense that closing their eyes meant loosening something inside themselves. Some claimed that when exhaustion set in, they heard it again. Not voices forming words, just intent. A pressure behind thought, a presence waiting for permission. It always arrived when the body was weakest. The experiment didn't create anything new. It didn't summon a monster or introduce an outside force. It revealed something that had always been there, held back by sleep, by rest, by the quiet mercy of unconsciousness. And once revealed, it couldn't be unseen. There's a reason the body insists on sleep. Not as a luxury, not as comfort, but as enforcement. A system older than language, older than warning signs, that pulls consciousness offline before it wanders too far on its own. When sleep arrives, it doesn't ask permission. It shuts doors, dims internal lights. It interrupts patterns that would otherwise continue unchecked, thoughts looping, impulses sharpening, awareness turning inward until it has nothing left to balance against. The men in that chamber learned something most people never do. That wakefulness isn't clarity. Left alone long enough, it becomes exposure. Every night, when you drift off, parts of you are gently muted. The impulses you don't act on, the thoughts you don't finish, the versions of yourself that don't need daylight. Sleep doesn't erase them, it delays them. So the question isn't why they changed in that room. The question is how long anyone can stay conscious before the mind stops protecting itself. What do you become when you stay awake long enough to meet everything inside you without restraint? Some experiments fail because the hypothesis is wrong. Others fail because the answer arrives too clearly to be useful. Those are the ones that get buried, redacted, labeled impossible. Not because they didn't work, but because they did. Next time, I'll tell you about another experiment. One where they didn't try to remove sleep. They tried to remove fear instead. What remained was something no one knew how to stop. Until then, remember this. Some doors were never meant to stay open, especially the ones inside us.